What is this manifesto? It's about the problems in Mythic Plus. We'll go through it from the start. So earlier today, there were a bunch of people protesting in LFG. They would just put up an LFG group saying protest, and then they would just type that how mad they were about the M plus system. Like they can't chest at 12, they can't get into a key, they can't play the meta spec, whatever. So that got me thinking. I was like, okay, so what are the problems in M plus right now? Because it does feel like for the average player base, there are a lot of problems that could be fixed very easily. So we wrote all the problems down. So the first problem I found, or I thought, is that there is a tank healer shortage. Now, there's always a tank healer shortage, right? Like the ideal ratio is there's one tank, one healer and one healer for every 3 DPS that are interested in playing. I don't think that's ever been the case in like the history of WoW. So I'm not going for that. But it would be nice to get some more tanks and healers playing the game. Because the ratio right now kind of sucks, in my opinion. You're just waiting way too long for a tank if you're a DPS player. So I was thinking, okay, how do we fix this? How do we make more people willing to play tank? So, uh, I think there's two main reasons people don't play tank. Number one, they're scared to solo deplete the key. There's too many tank busters right now that are just like use a cooldown or die. For instance, in Grimmatol, there's like the Lava Fist, Shadow Flame Slash, Dawnbreaker. We put a bunch of examples here of tank busters that are just straight up one shots if you don't have a cooldown, and they're happening so often that it's impossible to have a cooldown for all of them. So my answer was they could make these hit way less hard, so you can actually survive them without a cooldown as long as you have your active mid avail up. But they happen more often, so your healer has like an actual impact on keeping your tank alive. Because when they did all the tank nerfs, they said their stated goal was so that healers would be more impactful in keeping tanks alive. But then when they said that, after nerfing tank self healing, they also increased the cooldown of a lot of their defensives. So I think in order to actually have that work out, they need to also reduce the damage of all the tank busters. So that like if you get hit by a tank buster, for instance, City of Threads, like the subjugate from the first boss, that shouldn't kill you if you don't have a cooldown. It should just like get you really low and you die like the next two melees or something, so that your healer actually has a chance to do anything in the key. Here's a link. Okay. Uh, so that was the first thing that I thought they should change. Also, like basically this is causing a lot of people not only to not want to tank, because you don't want to be that guy that's signing up for a City of Threads 12. You get to the first boss and you just die. Like, 5 busters in, you finally ran out of cooldowns and you died. Now everyone hates you. They say you suck and you need to manage your cooldowns better, whatever. No one wants to be that guy. And also, no one wants to be the DPS when the tank is just feeding like that either. So I think they should just make that not happen as often, I guess, in lower keys. In high keys, whatever. That's fine. I'll deal with it. But for people who are just entering like the key pushing system, I think they shouldn't have to deal with that. So I think these busters should hit less hard. If they can happen more often, maybe they can add a dot or something. But they should not be one shotting tanks. They should do a lot of damage and then maybe do something else, or do a lot of damage more often. But they should not be one shotting the tank. All right. And then the other reason people don't want to play tank and healers, I think, is because those roles do no fucking damage compared to DPS. At least for me, when I was considering playing the healer role, I just looked at how much damage I was doing and it just immediately turned me off. Everyone knows the amount of fun you're having in Mythic Plus is directly correlated with the size of your bar on details. Everyone knows that. So if you want more people to play tanks and healers, you just need to make tanks and healers do more damage. This also has the added effect of making it so that tanks and healers are able to differentiate themselves from other tanks and healers without having things that make your tank and healer like the only person who can fail or succeed, right? For instance, let's say they do take my suggestion, right? They take my suggestion, they make it so these tank busters aren't one-shotting tanks anymore. Well, how do you tell the difference then between like a good tank and a bad tank who's just getting carried by his healer? Well, one way would be to make it so that tanks can actually contribute damage. So if you're a tank that's just AFK in the brain, only surviving keys, then you still can't time keys because you do no damage. Same way with healers, right? How do you differentiate if they make the healing checks easier? Then how do you tell a difference between a healer who's actually trying to do damage, fitting in every living flame he can, and a healer who's AFK on a payphone? Right now, you can't really tell as long as they can actually heal the keys. But if they increase healer active DPS, then it would matter a lot more. And they could, if they increase healer active DPS, they would also open the door to make healing checks easier because you would have more ways to tell a difference between two, like a really efficient healer and like a not that great healer, without having them like without being like making it very obvious because their group fucking wiped. Okay, so that's the number one problem, the tank and healer shortage, and those are my proposed solutions to address those. All right, the number two problem right now. So the number two problem, in my opinion, is that the jump in key levels is too steep. Like the difference between an 11 and a 12 is way too big. There are so many people right now that are just hard stuck at 11. They're like fiending for the dopamine that you get when you time a new key level, and they just can't get it because the jump from 11 to 12 is way too hard. So I think the solution to that is to make either they need to reduce the scaling per key level, or they need to remove both tyrannical and fortified, or remove Zalata's Guile. One of those, just make the difference between key levels a lot more granular. Right now, I think if you're like an M plus enjoyer, right? You actually care about Mythic Plus, you try to improve yourself, but you're not like a world class player. You realistically have like three levels you can actually play with, right? There's like 12, which is the first level that's considered like a key pushing level. 12, 13, and 14. Most people aren't doing 15s, right? In my opinion, the perfect ratio for tank, healer, and DPS damage, that's a good question. In my opinion, it should be tanks at 70% of a DPS's damage and healers at 50% of a DPS's damage while doing active DPS. Right now, I think it's like healers are at like 20% and tanks are at about 50 to 60. Will this become a YouTube video at some point? Very likely. Gotta farm the content. Okay, anyway, I think one big thing would be to either remove Zaltas Guile, like the nerfs were a step in the right direction, but the full answer is just to completely remove the affix. Or they could remove Tyrannical and Fortified from keys, or they could make the scaling a little less granular. But right now, people are just like getting hard stuck on key levels for way too long. Uh, they need to get the dopamine they get from timing a new key level more often before they quit the game. Okay, so that's the second most important thing, in my opinion. The third most important thing was the death timer. Increasing the death timer to 15 seconds has just made people way more selective when they're forming groups. So, your goal, in my opinion, at least one of your goals when you're designing Mythic Plus, should be to make it so that people are spending more time actually in the dungeons playing the game rather than in Dornogal with the party listing up, waiting for the perfect player to apply. And when they increase the death timer to 15 seconds, people are way more willing to just sit AFK in Dornogal waiting for the perfect player so they don't get some noob to int their key and, die like 3 times and give them minus 45. I get that they want to make it so that, high keys require a higher level of coordination. They don't want to see these like 50 death at Taldazar 29s getting timed. But I don't think the answer to that is to increase the death timer to 15 seconds. There's got to be some other way. In this season, it's also particularly bad because as an any int player who's playing with Spy Masters just loses infinite damage when they die, but that is another aside, I think. The solution, no death timers, back to 5 seconds or something like 10 seconds. I think five was the perfect number, to be honest. I think a Taldazar was like a particularly egregious example of like death timers not being long enough. But the problem in that dungeon wasn't death timers. The problem was that you could just literally do MDI pulls because you had a VDH in the group. Now that that's been addressed, you don't need to also increase the death timer. I think 5 seconds was perfectly fine. Or if they want to make it a 15-second timer, someone had the idea that they could have like a 5 death buffer. I think that's fine too. But 15 seconds is way too long. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that they should make it so that people can just clown around in keys and time it. I just want it. I just think 15 seconds is too far in the other direction. No, I don't. I don't want them to be zero penalty. I think 5 seconds was perfect. All right. Then the other thing people brought up was the change to, yeah, exactly, with the runbacks. Okay, the other change that people brought up was the non-interrupt interrupts. So like for instance, if a mob is casting and then you do an AoE stop and you snipe someone's kick, then it starts recasting. In a coordinated group, I think that mechanic is like kind of okay, but in a pug setting where people aren't in comms, expecting people to like predict at what time their allies are going to kick or use AoE stops is ridiculous. So I think they should revert the change. I think the main reason they put the change in the first place is because in Dragonflight, you basically didn't have to kick because you could replace kicks with AoE stops. Like you would just go DH 6 stops into Fire Mage 3 stops into Augvoker 3 stops into your Druid 2 more. If you had a Shaman, that's 2 more. So it was getting kind of ridiculous. I do agree with that. I think a good change could be to maybe make it the first one, the first time you overlap a kick with an AoE stop, it actually puts the spell on cooldown, and after that, it doesn't uh, single stops putting them not putting them on cooldown, or sorry, single stops putting them on cooldown and AoE stops putting them on cooldown also works. That's a great idea. Uh, or also increase the cooldown of AoE stops. Those are like some ways to fix the problem without griefing pugs, in my opinion.